Thank you, Professor Marlowe, for your kind introduction. So Professor Marlowe and I both come from Seton Hall University. We serve on the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science at Seton Hall. And today I'd like to discuss some of what I think is interesting work that has been done in the area of STEM education, particularly an interdisciplinary approach. So for the presentation today, I'm just going to speak briefly about the motivation, basically assisting our students to confront, to engage the big questions that we would hope would be addressed on a university campus. A little background about the university itself and the core curriculum, which will give you an insight in terms of the parameters that we had to guide our work. And then we'll look at 4 examples, very briefly, of some interesting classes that have been developed, and then say a brief word about maybe a map for future development that could apply to your own universities. Yesterday, Dr. Marlowe talked about the problem of siloing, and he showed this nice graphic that was originally from the Chronicle of Higher Education, which illustrates the ongoing dilemma we face in academia, and everyone's in their department, everyone's in their silo, and the cross-communication, the interaction, the opportunity for collaborative research is often very limited. So we're aware of the fact that these silos are there, but we also know that addressing some of these big questions require that we have more interactions than we're currently having. So we want to find a way to maybe knock some of these towers down and allow people to collaborate in an interdisciplinary way. So what are some of the big questions that we might be interested in? Well, at Seton Hall, we're a Catholic university, so we want to be able to enable students to consider questions about what is the relationship of the human brain, the human soul, the mind, computers, networks. How can one reconcile the modern theory of evolution with the biblical text of creation contained in the book of Genesis? What are the limits to knowledge? Can we know everything? Is everything knowable? What about social issues like relieving hunger? Solutions to problems like that often require not only a scientific approach, but also ethical considerations, economic considerations, sociological issues. I think this excerpt from an article by James Turner that was published in the journal Catholic Education really summarizes the problem well for us. Turner wrote, "Knowledge lies scattered around us and in great unconnected pieces, like lonely mesas jutting up in a trackless waste. That this fragmentation has impoverished public discourse is a more or less common lament. That it has emaciated education, both undergraduate and graduate, is too painfully obvious a truth to dwell on. So as we try to navigate through waves of uncertainty from one disciplinary island to another, all universities, not just Catholic ones, face the challenges and dilemmas of remapping the world of learning." We're going to go back to this at the end of the presentation, but I think for the purposes of our project, this is a very elegant summary of the problem. So again, I want to tell you just very briefly a little bit about our university to give you an insight in terms of the parameters for these core curriculum classes, particularly these STEM classes. The university was founded in 1856 by the Bishop of Newark, Bishop James Roosevelt Bailey, and he named it after his aunt, who was a canonized saint, Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton. It's the oldest diocesan university in the United States. Catholic universities tend to be either diocesan or run by a religious order, like the Jesuits or the Dominicans, the Benedictines. And we're a medium-sized university. We have 11 schools, covering most of the fields of inquiry. Unfortunately, we do not have an engineering school, and we're standing up a new school of medicine, which we're all very excited about. It's a very promising project in collaboration with Hackensack University and their medical system, which is a big hospital and healthcare network in the state of New Jersey. And the motivation for our university came from a very important gathering of bishops in 1844 in Baltimore, Maryland, and the goal was to bring Catholicism into higher education. The feeling of the bishops was that higher education is a very noble endeavor, and while Catholics were new to the public square, in a sense, in the United States at that point in our history, it was an area that we should become involved in. When the diocese, the ecclesiastical unit was established, the collection of parishes and schools and hospitals in 1853, immediately the leadership began thinking that we need a college, we need an institute of higher learning, and this is what led to Seton Hall. So what is our mission? Like every university, we're interested in the academic development of our students. But as a Catholic university, we're also very interested in ethical development, helping our students to develop values, to be leaders, we have the term servant leader, we use that a lot, to be servant leaders in a global society. And so our mission, as defined by our Board of Regents, emphasizes both the academic and the ethical. So already here, at the highest level, we see that there's an invitation to an interdisciplinary, more integrative approach. And one of the main vehicles that we have to explore this interdisciplinary education is in the university core curriculum. The way that the university is organized is that there is an Institute for Interdisciplinary Studies that oversees both the core curriculum, which would be part of the undergraduate education, as well as the Department of Catholic Studies. And there would be an interaction between these units, given the Catholic nature of the university. Just speaking for myself, one of the paradigms that I find very helpful in orienting my work in this space is following the thought of Benedict XVI, our last Holy Father, who often spoke and wrote about embracing the full breadth of rationality, not limiting our definition or our scope of reason or rationality, but being open to the full breadth of our capabilities as human people. So in the context of the core curriculum, we're looking to develop a general education approach to encourage students to become thinking, caring, communicative, and ethically responsible leaders. And the way that we do this, in part, is through these 6 common courses that are obligatory for all undergraduates. The current director of the core curriculum, Professor Sciglitano, summarizes the vision of the core. He says, rooted in Catholic tradition, we draw upon the resources of that tradition as we engage people of all faiths, cultural and religious traditions, as well as those without faith. Our Catholic commitment to the dignity and freedom of the human person means that we seek to educate the whole person, body, mind, and spirit. So again, the orientation is a very holistic one, emphasizing integrative education and engaging the big questions, some of which I offered in one of the early slides. We want our students to think about, what is the best way to live my life? What does it mean to instantiate justice in our world? What kind of communities lead to authentic flourishing of humankind? And of particular interest is the relationship between science and religion. So in our core courses, we seek to instigate really a very lively, passionate, and hopefully intelligent discussion on these kinds of issues. There's a sequence of what are called we call three signature courses, and these are rooted in the Catholic intellectual tradition, but they seek to bring that tradition into dialogue with other faiths, other cultures, other human experiences. And it is our desire that in exploring the interaction of Catholicism with other cultures and religions, that students will grow in their self-knowledge, develop habits of intellectual and ethical engagement, and hone critical thinking skills. Here are our signature courses, and we also have, as most universities do, some kind of orientation course to university life, as well as some basic writing and rhetoric course. So that first signature course, we call it the Journey of Transformation. And this is where we seek to, for the first time perhaps, instigate that dialogue between the Catholic tradition and other world cultures and traditions. It allows the students to learn a little history, learn a little philosophy, and realize that all humanity is seeking to answer some common questions. Where do I come from? Where am I going? Where can I find love? Okay? And answers are found, of course, in religion and philosophy, but also in art, in music, and literature. So we want to encourage the students to engage a variety of fields, to take a very, very multidisciplinary approach. And in addition to reading the Old and New Testaments and the writings of different Catholic intellectuals, they're encouraged to explore writings from the Islamic world, from the Hindu tradition, the Jewish tradition, to assist them in their own personal journey. The second course basically is a direct follow-up. It's entitled Christianity and Culture in Dialogue. And it's in this course that we seek to help the students to explore the relationship between Christianity and culture. And again, to pair the texts from the Christian tradition with non-Christian traditions. And finally, we get to the third signature course, courses, which I think are the most interesting. The third signature courses are all disciplinary specific. They build on the foundational principles of the first courses and allow students to explore personal interests, perhaps in an area of major or minor study, or perhaps a completely different field that is of interest to them. This is just a kind of a random selection of courses from different academic departments to show you the breadth of these core three classes. The first class is from the Department of English on literature and film. The second is from the History Department, Medieval Italy. Classics Department, Death and Afterlife in Antiquity. Philosophy, St. Augustine. Diplomacy School, Religion, Law, War. The College of Nursing, Religious Values in Healthcare. The College of Business has one on global business. The School of Education and Psychology has one on leadership through service learning. So this gives you a sense of the breadth of topics that are fair game in this engaging the world approach. But for the audience here, I'm sure you're most interested in topics in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And we're also trying to develop courses in that space, and that's what I'm going to speak about briefly today. Two courses that I've developed or co-developed, as well as two others. So this first course, which is what I developed, is called Creation in Science, and it's cross-listed with the School of Theology, our seminary, and with the Department of Catholic Studies. And the goal is to really deepen a student's understanding of the relationship between the Catholic theology of creation and contemporary empirical science. We look at the birth of science from a historical perspective, the historical philosophical environment surrounding its birth, the intervention of the popes, particularly over the last 250 years, on issues of science. We get into a little physics and cosmology to give the students, who many of them are not coming from a science background, some notion of the specificity of the cosmos. From the point of view of aesthetics, we want to highlight the beauty and unity of the cosmos, the importance, both metaphysically and epistemologically, of philosophical realism, moderate realism. The Catholic doctrine based on the book of Genesis, which would be shared by other faiths as well, of creation from nothing and with time. We also cover a bit of the theory of the Big Bang, the theory of evolution, the role of mathematics in the natural sciences, some fundamentals of climate science and ecology, and the dialogue between theological anthropology and modern psychology, particularly focusing on the role of theories of personality and how they are compatible or perhaps not with Catholic theological anthropology. The way I begin the course is to show how early Christian thought built on the great accomplishments of many of the pre-Christian civilizations, Greece, Rome, Egypt, China, etc., who made tremendous contributions to human knowledge. Then we seek to show how the development of empirical science in Europe is a direct result of the dialogue between the Greek tradition, particularly the tradition of Aristotle and his realism, and the Christian doctrine of creation from nothing and with time. Of course, because it touches on theology, we look at the Old and New Testaments, we look at the ecumenical councils of the church, and certainly the writings of these great pre-Christian civilizations. So our objectives are to teach the students something about the history of science, to give them an understanding of the Catholic theology of creation, to introduce them to the papal magisterium on the topic of faith and science, to clarify the scientific method. Some of them have not looked at the scientific method as a method since elementary school. So we try to reflect on that. And then there's a variety of themes that the students, of course, come with great interest, but maybe not with so much background knowledge. So we try to supply that, and of course emphasizing primary sources. The second course that I'm involved with was a co-developed class with Professor Marlowe, who many of you know, who's a very talented applied mathematician and computer scientist. And the course is entitled Logic and the Limits to Knowledge. If you were present for the paper presentation on this class, you know that the background for this course in particular was that many of our students in math and computer science, in philosophy, had an introductory logic course, but it stopped there. And there was an opportunity to develop an advanced topics course to extend their knowledge, to deepen their knowledge, and to allow them to see the real plethora of applications of logic in computing and engineering in so many technological fields. We begin, of course, with a historical approach, looking at the history of mathematics and logic in particular, and how that development has interacted with the Catholic and wider Western tradition. We cover topics in first-order logic, provable limits to knowledge. We look at the grade 3 unsolvable problems of Euclidean geometry, and then some more modern topics from Gödel, Turing, Arrow, and from physics, such as quantum mechanics and chaos theory. Throughout our treatment of all these topics, we try to emphasize epistemological issues. How do we know what we say we know? And while these two questions may seem simple, as the course develops, the students realize that they're not so trivial. What is logic? What are its limits? And our framework for considering that is Christianity's broader view of the human person and of human intelligence. So our goals were to assist the students to acquire a deeper perception of the uses and limits of knowledge and some of the extensions, particularly in philosophy, math, and computer science, to understand the interaction between logic and philosophy and theology, and to help the students to appreciate that logical and scientific investigations usually, or perhaps always, have limitations, even within their own domains. And it's important for intellectual honesty and for credibility to be aware of those limitations. We also hoped to allow the students to acquire a more sophisticated view of human reason, of cognition and processes of the mind. Students were taught to translate natural language statements into first or second order formal logic to produce simple proofs. They were expected to understand and explain the differences between first and second order logic and the various extensions that we presented in class. To learn about the extensions and applications, particularly in the area of computing. And to have some knowledge of the development of logic, going back to the ancient Greeks and other ancient peoples, through the modern era, the formalization of logic into the present. Students were expected to be able to express a coherent argument on some limits to knowledge, and to be able to make a distinction between having a scientific worldview and having a worldview that is often categorized as scientism, which is a philosophical position. The third course I'd like to take a look at was developed by Father Jerry Bonapane. Father Bonapane is a chemist specializing in food chemistry, and before entering the priesthood, he worked for the Food and Drug Administration as well as had a faculty appointment. And Father Bonapane has developed this new course entitled The Science and Theology of Food. And this is a course that seeks to effect an integration of scientific, theological, cultural, and ethical dimensions of food. And again, we have these seemingly basic questions, but as I'm sure his students will discover next semester when the course runs for the first time, these are not so simple questions. What is food and what is eating? The scientific dimension of food is enormous. Of course, we have this whole discipline of food science, Father Bonapane's specialty. The agricultural component is very significant: planting, growing, harvesting of plants, raising and slaughtering of animals for food. Healthy eating is something that we're all concerned with, or should be concerned with. And there are so many dietary trends, so many products and services. So this class hopes to assist the students to understand these various diets, their merits and detriments. Also to have a greater appreciation of the fact of malnutrition, food coping mechanisms for stress, food consumption trends. And from a theological perspective, of course, what does the Bible say about food and food aid? For Christians, of course, Jesus Christ is the central figure. What does he say about food? What about the Catholic Mass as a sacred meal, the Eucharist? Taboos about food, the notion of feasting and fasting at different times. So this class follows the approach of Pope St. John Paul II, that the human spirit has two wings, the wing of faith and the wing of reason, and it's with both wings that the spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. Through this class, Father Bodipain hopes to demonstrate to the students a deeper understanding of food science, particularly its chemistry and nutritional qualities, to apply this knowledge to dietetic decisions, to consider issues of food stability and security, quality, the reality of food addictions, and the problem of malnutrition and hunger. There are two main textbooks for this class, one from the science perspective and one from the theological perspective, and of course the Bible will be used. The last course I want to look at briefly is a course co-developed by a computer scientist and a psychologist. Professor Vigorito is a behavioral neuroscientist. He investigates learning and behavior in laboratory rodents. And Professor Watchsmith is a applied mathematician and computer scientist specializing in robotics and small device programming. They developed this very interesting course, Robotics and the Mind. And in this class, they hope to explore the relationship between the Catholic theological tradition and scientific research on the question of what does it mean to be human. In addition to the philosophical, theological reading and the theoretical discussions, students are engaged in a learning activity to develop and program a variety of robots. And students are encouraged to address some very interesting fundamental questions, such as, are humans and animals mechanistic biological machines? What does it mean when a Christian says that he has a soul? Are the body and soul separate, or are they one? And can a mind or can a soul emerge in an autonomous, non-biological machine? And these questions are addressed from a very interdisciplinary perspective of psychology, computer science, neuroscience, philosophy, and theology. And as I mentioned, their theoretical exploration of these questions is enhanced by some hands-on robotic engineering. These professors have found that by using robots to help distinguish what can and cannot be readily explained by simple processes helps the students to better define who we are as people in an age of rapidly expanding scientific knowledge. And again, going back to that perspective of John Paul II of the wings of faith and reason. So students are encouraged to reflect on that relationship, faith and reason. They're provided with the opportunity to engage in a dialogue linking the Catholic tradition with the scientific study of humans, of animals, and of artificial intelligence. To reflect on the journey of the human species as a result of both natural and technological change, and to develop a rudimentary understanding of robotics, to learn some basic programming skills in Java. This is just a brief survey of some of the topics for the readings and discussions that occur in class. The notion of scientific materialism, and the impact of that position on questions of meaning and purpose. Again, the mind-body question, dualism, monism. The place of neuroscience in relationship with the mind and the soul. And of course, evolution. And what about robots? Sensation, perception, adaptive behavior. What about questions of emotion, empathy, morality? We often think about them in the context of humans, but is it appropriate to discuss emotions, empathy, and morality with animals. What about machines? Just a little bit about the robot design portion of the class. As I mentioned, Java is the language, the programming language. The students are introduced to algorithm-based robots, behavior-based robots, programming with sensory perception, simple behaviors, and learning behaviors. So it's really quite an impressive introduction to programming in general and robotics in particular. Again, some fundamental questions about what is intelligence? How does disembodied intelligent computers or machines compare with embodied intelligence? Does evidence of mechanistic control of behavior in robots, animals, and humans require a view of a deterministic world that is without meaning or purpose? Or is there another perspective? Is self-awareness a necessary component of intelligent behavior? What is the role of emotion in humans, in animals? How does desire impact intelligent behavior? Where does morality come from? Is the presence of multiple autonomous intelligent bodies a necessary and sufficient condition for the emergence of morality? What about questions of self-worth, the desire to know, awe, spirituality? Are these uniquely human? Could a robot in the future experience these? So I want to go back to our basic statement of problem, this scattering of knowledge, this fragmentation of knowledge. Is it possible to find what we might call a map to help orient us in interdisciplinary education, in the integration of knowledge to address big questions? Well, I think there is, and so does my colleague, Monsignor Richard Liddy, who points us to a very important 20th century philosopher, Father Bernard Lonergan. Monsignor Liddy is the director of our Center for Catholic Studies and would share the concern that I voiced at the beginning of the presentation on the siloing of disciplines, on the lack of integration of knowledge. And again, in the journal Catholic Education, Monsignor Liddy wrote, "What is needed is a map, that is, some way of knowing how the various areas of knowledge are related and whether we as human beings are going in the right direction." He points to Lonergan's 1957 work, Insight, a study of human understanding, which aims at an insight into insight, an explanatory understanding of the dynamics of human understanding, a basic method followed by the human spirit at the basis of all other methods. Lonergan is Insight is a major work, technical work of Lonergan, and Monsignor Liddy summarizes very elegantly here. In Insight, Lonergan analyzes the concrete unfolding of mathematical, scientific, and philosophical methods, paying attention, as Einstein cautioned, to what scientists do rather than what they say they do. In another famous book, Method and Theology, 1972, Lonergan extended his analysis to scholarly historical methods of understanding and how they can be functionally linked to theological methods. Lonergan traces the dynamic method of the human spirit. He uses the terms experiencing, understanding, and judging. He says that in scientific activity, these basic levels unfold through processes of experimentation, hypothesis, formation, and verification. On the other side of the campus, in the domain of history, we have the processes of research, interpretation, and historical judgment. If we look at the key chapter of Insight, the self-affirmation of the knower, Lonergan invites readers to check within their own consciousness and find out whether or not this analysis of the basic method of the human spirit of experiencing, understanding, and judging is correct. Liddy says if it is correct, then it is the basis for the integration of all areas of knowing. An accurate account of human interiority as it manifests itself in the various methods employed by the human spirit is the basis for a philosophical vision strong enough to integrate the various scientific and scholarly methods. So I would like to end this presentation with questions for all of you, questions that I don't expect you to answer right now or even today, but to take with you. Given what I've presented, I'd like you to think about how can other institutions benefit? How can the approach that we have taken at Seton Hall be applied for a public university? What about a non-Catholic Christian university? What about a non-Christian university? What about in the international setting, outside of the United States? For those of you who are involved in the mission of higher education, I encourage you to reflect on ways that perhaps you could better integrate ethics into STEM education, values, spirituality, existential questions, epistemology, metaphysics. I think if we want to equip our students to approach these big questions, these factors have to be presented in some way, in a way that is permissible in the university context and consistent, of course, with your university mission. Thank you very much.